The Vanishing Bride, a Helena Monroe investigation. Chapter 1. A Perfect Disappearance. The voicemail came late in the evening, crackling with quiet desperation. "Ms. Monroe, please, I need your help. My sister, she's missing." Helena Monroe listened as Valeria Sanchez pleaded for her to return the call. A missing person case was nothing new, but there was something in the way Sophia's voice wavered more than fear. It was certainty. She didn't just believe something had happened to her sister, Valeria Sanchez. She knew it. Helena sat at her desk, fingers drumming against the worn wooden surface as the message replayed in her mind. People didn't vanish without a reason. And if there was one thing Helena had learned in her years as both an FBI criminal profiler and now a private investigator, it was that disappearances, especially of women, often had an explanation far more sinister than anyone wanted to admit. The next morning, Sophia arrived at Helena's office. She was in her late 20s, her dark brown eyes sharp with determination but rimmed with exhaustion. She clutched a faded photograph of Valeria in her hands. The image was of a beautiful woman, her high cheekbones and warm smile exuding confidence. But the worry in Sophia's face told Helena that confidence had been broken long before she disappeared. "She married Mark Caldwell 6 months ago," Sophia explained, smoothing the edges of the photo. "At first, everything seemed fine. She sent pictures, talked about their house, their trips. Then she stopped calling. Her texts became different, short, cold. And now she's just gone." Helena leaned forward. The shift in communication, especially for women in new marriages, was always a red flag. "When was the last time you heard from her?" 3 weeks ago. A single text. It said, "I'm fine. Don't worry. But I know my sister, Ms. Monroe." That wasn't her. It was like someone else was writing it. Helena nodded, already taking notes. "And her husband. What does he say?" Sophia's lips tightened. "Mark filed a missing persons report 2 weeks ago. He told the police they had an argument, and she left to clear her head. But that doesn't make sense. Valeria wouldn't leave without telling me where she was going." Helena tapped her pen against the desk. A wealthy, well-connected businessman whose wife conveniently vanished after an argument? It wasn't the first time she had heard that story. "What do the police think?" Helena asked. "They think she left voluntarily. They won't investigate further unless there's evidence of foul play." Sophia shook her head in frustration. "I tried showing them our texts, telling them something wasn't right, but they brushed me off. They told me women leave their marriages all the time." Helena exhaled slowly. She had seen this before. When a woman disappears, people assume she walked away. When a man disappears, they assume the worst has happened to him. "Something happened to her," Sophia said firmly. "And I need you to prove it." Helena studied her carefully. No panic. No over-the-top dramatics. Just certainty. It was the same look she had seen in other families who knew deep in their bones that something was terribly wrong. She took a deep breath and closed her notebook. "Then let's start with Mark Caldwell." Mark Caldwell's estate was an architectural masterpiece. Pristine, calculated, and emotionless. It suited the man himself. When Helena arrived unannounced, he greeted her at the door, his expression one of polite curiosity. "Ms. Monroe, was it? I was told Sophia hired a private investigator. Please come in." Inside, the house was too perfect. Like a showroom rather than a home. No signs of Valeria, no photographs of the couple. As if she had never been there. "I assume you're here about my wife?" Mark asked smoothly, leading her to a minimalist sitting room. He spoke calmly, precisely, too controlled. "Yes," Helena replied. Tell me about the last time you saw her. Mark exhaled, rehearsed exhaustion in his tone. She was struggling. Adjusting to life here wasn't easy. She felt lost. After a disagreement, she packed a bag and left. That was 3 weeks ago. I filed a missing persons report immediately. Helena let the silence stretch before asking, "And you didn't go after her?" Mark's lips twitched, mild amusement or irritation. "I wanted to respect her wishes. She needed space. I was giving it to her." Helena glanced around. "I'd like to see Valeria's belongings." Mark hesitated for half a second, just enough. Then he nodded. Of course. He led her upstairs to a perfectly arranged walk-in closet. Valeria's clothes, untouched. No gaps, no missing shoes. No signs she packed anything at all. A woman leaving wouldn't abandon her essentials. Helena filed the detail away. "I'd like to speak with your staff. Housekeepers, security, anyone who saw her before she left." Mark's smile was tight. "I see where this is going. You think I had something to do with her disappearance?" Helena held his gaze. "I think someone did." That evening, back in her office, Helena sat at her desk, reviewing her notes. Valeria's sudden personality shift, the untouched belongings, the husband's carefully worded statements. Every part of this case felt staged. Her gut told her Valeria never left that house voluntarily. But proving it, that would take more than just intuition. It would take digging into Mark Caldwell's past, his secrets, and the one place in his estate he seemed to avoid, the locked guest house. Chapter 2. The Guest House Secret. Helena parked a block away from Mark Caldwell's sprawling estate and cut the engine. The house loomed in the distance, bathed in the soft glow of exterior lighting, its grand facade a picture of wealth and perfection. But Helena knew better than to trust appearances. Perfection often masked the ugliest of secrets. Earlier that day, she had spoken to Caldwell in his carefully curated home. Everything about his demeanor had been polished, every word chosen deliberately. He had played the part of the concerned husband flawlessly, but Helena had spent years studying people. Something was off. He was too controlled, too composed. And then there was the matter of Valeria's belongings untouched, as if she had never planned to leave at all. But what unsettled her most was the guest house. Mark had barely mentioned it during their conversation, yet his avoidance of the topic had been noticeable. There was a weight to his silence, an unspoken effort to divert attention from it. It sat at the edge of the property, separate from the main house, its windows dark. If Valeria had left behind anything she wasn't supposed to, it would be there. Helena waited until nightfall before making her move. She parked her car down the road and slipped out, walking along the tree line, keeping to the shadows. From this angle, she had a clear view of the guest house, a small but elegant structure separate from the main mansion. The lights were off, the curtains mostly drawn, but a small gap left between them. No movement inside. She checked her watch, 2:07 a.m. The estate was quiet, the staff long asleep. She had planned her approach carefully, just a glance inside, nothing more. She hesitated. She wasn't forcing her way inside, but this was still trespassing, a risk she couldn't ignore. Trespassing on private property, especially a wealthy man's estate, carried serious risks. But Helena had spent years watching the system fail women like Valeria. If the police weren't going to do their jobs, she would. Besides, she wasn't breaking in. She just needed to see what they weren't showing her. The night was warm, but a cool breeze whispered through the leaves. The faint scent of freshly cut grass clung to the air as she reached the perimeter of the guest house. She approached the window cautiously, careful not to disturb the silence. Cupping her hands around her flashlight to dim its beam, She peered through the small gap in the curtains. She flicked it on for just a second, enough to sweep the interior. Pristine. Too pristine. A small bed with perfectly arranged sheets, a vanity with an untouched jewelry box, a neatly stacked pile of books on the nightstand. It was as if someone had staged the space to appear lived in, but no one had truly been here in weeks. Then she saw it. A single chair placed awkwardly near the closet. It seemed out of place, as if someone had been sitting there for extended periods, watching, waiting. She squinted, shifting the flashlight slightly. The beam caught the faint outline of something on the glass, a word smudged into the window pane. She leaned closer, breath fogging against the surface. Someone had written in the condensation once, a plea, now almost faded. Help. Her pulse quickened. Helena ran her fingers lightly over the glass, feeling the ghost of the letters beneath her touch. This wasn't old graffiti or a careless scribble. This was deliberate. This was desperation. A noise outside made her freeze, a faint rustling, barely perceptible. Helena quickly switched off her flashlight, heart pounding. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Someone was near. She pressed herself against the side of the guest house, barely breathing. A shadow passed near the main house, pausing briefly before continuing around the back. Security? Or something worse? Helena waited, body tense. After a minute, the footsteps faded into the night. She let out a quiet breath. Too close. She had what she came for. And now she had more questions than answers. One thing was certain. Valeria hadn't left on her own. And whatever had happened to her, Mark Caldwell knew more than he was saying. Helena took one last glance at the window before retreating into the shadows. She would need more than a word on the glass to prove anything, but she had no doubt this was a cry for help. Disappearing into the night, she knew her search was only beginning. Chapter 3. The Woman No One Missed. Helena sat in her car, the faint glow of the dashboard clock illuminating the time 4:12 a.m. She had been parked outside her office for the last 10 minutes, gripping the steering wheel, replaying every detail of the night in her mind. Help. It hadn't been written in ink or carved into wood. It had been a fleeting message, fading into the window pane like a whisper no one had heard except her. And that made it worse. Someone had cried out for help, and no one had been listening. With a sigh, she grabbed her notepad from the passenger seat, flipping to a fresh page. She jotted down everything she had seen, the chair, the immaculate room, the eerie silence. Valeria had been in that guest house. Recently. The real question was she still alive? By mid-morning, Helena had exhausted her usual sources. She had combed through public records, pulled up property deeds, and sifted through Caldwell's past. Unsurprisingly, his history was spotless, too spotless. Wealth had a way of erasing inconvenient details. But then she found something. A name buried in an old employment log for Caldwell's estate, Catherine Alden. Not a housekeeper, not a gardener. A former personal assistant. Her tenure had ended abruptly 5 years ago, and there was no trace of her after that. No forwarding address, no social media updates, nothing. As if she had simply stopped existing, Helena leaned back in her chair, staring at the name on her screen. One missing woman was suspicious. 2 was a pattern. Tracking down Catherine Alden was harder than she expected. Calls to old acquaintances led to dead ends. Online searches turned up nothing beyond an outdated LinkedIn profile. It wasn't until she ran a cross-check on voter registration records that she found an address, a small apartment complex on the outskirts of Arlington. By late afternoon, she was parked outside the rundown building, the paint on the exterior faded and peeling. If Catherine had worked for one of the wealthiest men in the state, she wasn't living like it now. Helena knocked twice. No answer. She tried again, this time louder, a shuffle from inside. Then a voice, wary. "Who is it? Catherine Alden? My name is Helena Monroe. I just need to ask you a few questions about Mark Caldwell." A long pause. Then slowly, the door cracked open, revealing a woman in her mid-40s, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She took one look at Helena and muttered, "I don't talk about him." "I think you should," Helena said, keeping her voice calm. "This is about Valeria Sanchez. She's missing." Something flickered in Catherine's expression. "She's gone too, isn't she?" Helena's stomach knotted. "What do you mean too?" Catherine exhaled shakily. "Because that's what he does. He makes women disappear." For the next hour, Catherine spoke in hushed tones, her hands trembling as she recounted her time working for Caldwell. She had been his personal assistant for 3 years, long enough to learn what most people didn't. Mark Caldwell controlled everything. He dictated where his wife went, who she spoke to, how she lived. And when they stopped being what he wanted, when they tried to leave, they simply vanished. "I tried to warn someone once," Catherine whispered, gripping the edges of her worn cardigan. "A woman before Valeria? Her name was Lauren. She was his first wife. She told me she was leaving. The next day, she was just gone. Mark said she went to Europe, that she wanted a new life. But there was no record of her leaving the country. No plane tickets, no bank withdrawals, nothing." "And you think the same thing happened to Valeria?" Catherine let out a bitter laugh. "I know it did. And if you're smart, you'll stop looking." Helena studied the woman in front of her. Catherine was terrified, not just of the past, but of what Mark Caldwell could still do. "I can't do that," Helena said, voice steady. "But you can help me make sure Valeria isn't the next woman to disappear forever." Catherine hesitated. Then, reluctantly, she said, "There's a place, a house, not the main estate, another one. He keeps it off the books. If Valeria's alive, that's where she'll be." Helena's pulse quickened. "Where?" Catherine swallowed hard. "A cabin, up in the Blue Ridge Mountains. I went there once, a long time ago. It's isolated. No one would hear her scream." The words sent a chill down Helena's spine. She had come looking for a missing woman. Now she was hunting a predator. Chapter 4. Buried Truths. Helena drove through the winding roads of the Blue Ridge Mountains, her fingers gripping the steering wheel as she mentally replayed her conversation with Catherine Alden. A hidden cabin. Off the books. If Mark Caldwell had gone to such lengths to keep this place secret, then it wasn't just another vacation home. It was something else entirely. The address Catherine had given her wasn't easy to find. The property wasn't listed in any public records, but Catherine had remembered enough details for Helena to trace it through a land trust registered under an unrelated corporation. A shell game. One wealthy men played when they wanted to own things without leaving a trail. Helena's GPS signaled her turn onto an unmarked gravel road. The dense forest closed in around her, the towering pines casting long, eerie shadows. She killed the headlights as she approached what looked like an old wooden gate, more for keeping out wanderers than real security. Whoever used this place didn't expect visitors. Helena parked a short distance away and continued on foot, her boots crunching against the dirt path. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, but something else lingered underneath. Something stale, something wrong. She reached a clearing, and there it was. A small, isolated cabin nestled between the trees. It looked ordinary enough, but Helena had learned a long time ago that horror rarely came wrapped in something obvious. It was the silence that gave it away. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. As if the place had been holding its breath, she took a cautious step closer, scanning the perimeter. The windows were covered, the porch coated in a thin layer of dust. No recent activity. But that didn't mean it hadn't been used recently. She crept around the side, her pulse quickening as she peered through a narrow gap in the boarded-up window. The inside was dark, but her flashlight caught a glimpse of a mattress on the floor, a chair, and what looked like chains bolted into the wall. Her stomach turned. This wasn't just a hideaway. Someone had been kept here. She pulled out her phone, snapping quick pictures before moving toward the door. Locked. No surprise. She tried the back, also locked. But near the threshold, something caught her eye. Disturbed dirt, as if someone had dug and hastily covered something. Kneeling down, she brushed away a layer of loose soil. Her fingers hit something solid, a piece of fabric. She tugged gently, unearthed more, and then stopped cold. A shoe, dirt-covered but unmistakably designer. A woman's shoe. Helena sat back, swallowing the bile that rose in her throat. She forced herself to breathe. This could mean anything. A lost item, a buried stash of discarded clothes. But in her gut, she knew. This wasn't carelessness. This was a grave someone had tried to forget. A sound snapped her attention upward. A car engine. Distant, but approaching. Helena shoved the dirt back over the exposed fabric and moved swiftly behind the cabin, pressing her back against the wall. The crunch of tires on gravel grew louder. She peeked around the corner. A dark SUV, sleek and expensive, rolled to a stop just beyond the gate. Mark Caldwell. Even from a distance, she could see his expression. Calm, composed, but his movements were tight. Controlled fury. He knew someone had been here. Helena weighed her options. She could wait, see what he did, or she could get out while she still had the chance. One misstep, and she could end up in the same grave she suspected lay beneath the soil. Caldwell stepped out of the SUV, phone in hand, scanning the area. He moved toward the cabin, unlocking the door. If he had nothing to hide, why come all this way? Why check? Helena took a slow step back, careful not to snap a branch or disturb the silence. She had seen enough. Now she needed proof. Real proof. As she turned to retreat, a branch snapped in the woods, not from her, but from the other side of the clearing. She froze, pressing herself lower behind the thick trunk of a tree. Another set of footsteps, lighter than Caldwell's, moved through the underbrush. Someone else was here. Watching. Caldwell's head snapped up. He stood still, eyes narrowing toward the tree line. Then, after a long moment, he exhaled and continued toward the cabin. Whoever else was there had either been unnoticed or deemed unimportant. Helena didn't wait to find out which. She turned, slipping into the trees, leaving behind only the faintest of footprints. As she disappeared into the darkness, one thought burned in her mind. Valeria had been here. And if Helena didn't move fast, she wouldn't be the last. Chapter 5. Unseen Eyes. Helena drove in silence, the hum of the engine the only sound against the weight pressing on her chest. The shoe, the chains bolted to the wall, the way Caldwell had scanned the area, knowing, just knowing, that someone had been there before him. And then, the other footsteps. Someone else had been watching too. She glanced in her rearview mirror, scanning the empty road behind her. She was still deep in the mountains, the dense trees lining the road swallowing the starlight. The farther she got from the cabin, the more the adrenaline in her veins started to settle. But something else remained, a gnawing sense of unease. She knew Caldwell had secrets, but she wasn't the only one looking for them. Someone else was hunting in the dark. By the time she returned to her office, the sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in muted pinks and golds. She shut the door behind her, double-checking the lock before dropping into her chair. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through the pictures she had taken at the cabin. Each one made her stomach twist. What were you doing to her, Mark? The problem was, none of this was enough to prove anything. A locked cabin, a dirt-covered shoe, a word smudged onto glass. She had pieces, but nothing she could take to the police and expect action. She needed more. She needed to know exactly who else had been there last night. Pulling up a secure database, Helena ran a scan of local property records, zoning permits, anything that could link the hidden cabin to Mark Caldwell in a way that wasn't buried under corporate shielding. She wasn't expecting much, but then something caught her eye. A hunting permit. The land the cabin sat on had been listed under a seasonal hunting lease 5 years ago. The name on the permit? Logan Parker. Helena frowned. Who the hell was Logan Parker? It took hours of digging before she found a real lead. Parker wasn't just some random name tied to the lease. He was an ex-cop. A former detective with the state police, discharged under suspicious circumstances. The records were sealed, but Helena knew how to read between the lines. Officially, he had left due to misconduct. Unofficially, he had been investigating something that someone powerful wanted buried. She picked up her phone and dialed a contact at the local precinct. "Hey, Mason, it's Monroe. I need you to pull a name for me, Logan Parker. I want to know where he is now." Mason sighed on the other end. "That's not a name I've heard in a while. You working a case?" "Something like that. I'll see what I can find. But if you're looking into Parker, you're about 5 years too late. That guy disappeared off the grid after he got canned. No one's seen him since." Helena tapped her pen against her desk. First, Catherine Alden vanished. Now, Parker. Too many ghosts in Caldwell's past, and she had a sinking feeling they weren't all walking away willingly. "Just see what you can find," she said before hanging up. She leaned back, staring at the wall. Who was Parker watching that night? Me or Caldwell? She decided to find out for herself. If Parker had been keeping tabs on Caldwell, there was a good chance he had left breadcrumbs. People like him didn't just disappear. They hid. And Helena knew how to find people who didn't want to be found. She started with the basics. Burner phone records, credit card trails, vehicle registrations, anything that suggested he had resurfaced. Nothing. Then she cross-checked his old badge number, looking for unresolved cases he had worked before his dismissal. That's when she found it. A missing persons report. Lauren Caldwell, Caldwell's first wife. The one Catherine had mentioned. Helena's pulse kicked up. Logan Parker hadn't just been watching Caldwell. He had been investigating him. And if Parker had been investigating Lauren's disappearance 5 years ago, that meant he knew exactly what kind of man Mark Caldwell was. She was just about to dig deeper when a soft chime sounded from her laptop. A notification. One of her search alerts had flagged a hit. An ATM withdrawal. Logan Parker, 20 miles outside of town. He was still alive. Helena grabbed her keys and headed for the door. She had found her next lead. Now she just had to hope he hadn't already ended up like Lauren. Chapter 6. A Man in the Shadows. Helena parked across from the gas station where Logan Parker had made his ATM withdrawal. It was a rundown stop on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that hadn't been updated in decades. A flickering neon sign buzzed weakly against the encroaching dusk, casting jagged light over the cracked pavement. It was the last place a man like Parker would choose if he didn't want to be noticed. She scanned the lot. A couple of trucks, an old sedan, no sign of anyone lingering. But just because she couldn't see him didn't mean he wasn't watching. If Parker had been running for years, he wouldn't make himself easy to find. Helena slid out of her car, adjusting her coat as she crossed the lot. Inside, the smell of stale coffee and gasoline lingered in the air. A bored cashier barely glanced at her from behind the counter. "Long drive?" he asked lazily. Helena had driven straight from her office the moment the ATM hit appeared in her search alert. It wasn't far, only an hour's drive, but she had pushed the speed limit, knowing this could be her only chance to find Parker before he disappeared again. "Something like that," she murmured, picking up a pack of gum and setting it on the counter. "That guy who used the ATM earlier, older, rough-looking, maybe paranoid. Did you see where he went?" The cashier blinked, suddenly more awake. "You a cop?" "No." Helena slid a 20 across the counter. "Just looking for an old friend." The cashier hesitated, but greed won out. He pocketed the bill. Didn't say much, kept his head down, walked out the back. He tilted his chin toward the rear exit. Might still be around. Helena nodded, pocketing the gum. "Thanks." She stepped out the back door into a narrow alley lined with overflowing dumpsters. A gust of wind sent a newspaper skittering across the ground. At first, nothing seemed out of place. Then, a shift in the shadows. Helena turned slowly. "Parker?" For a long moment, nothing. Then a figure emerged from behind the dumpster, his movements careful but tense. Logan Parker had the look of a man who had once been built like a fighter, but had been worn down by too many sleepless nights and too many regrets. His face was partially obscured by a cap, his beard unevenly trimmed. His eyes, however, were sharp, measuring her, calculating. "Who are you?" His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it in days. "Helena Monroe, private investigator." He let out a humorless laugh. "That's supposed to impress me." "Not really. But I think you and I are after the same thing." Parker's amusement faded. "You're looking into Caldwell." Helena nodded. "You were investigating Lauren Caldwell when you were forced out of the force, weren't you? And now another wife has disappeared." Parker's jaw tightened. He shifted, glancing past her as if checking for threats. "What do you know?" "Enough to know you disappeared for a reason. Enough to know Caldwell has a pattern," Parker exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "That bastard ruins people. When I started looking into Lauren, I didn't just lose my job, I lost everything. They buried the case, erased files, made sure I couldn't get hired anywhere else." "Who's they?" Helena pressed. "People who protect men like Caldwell. Lawyers, politicians, cops who like their paychecks more than justice." Parker's voice was tight with anger. "Lauren never left the country. She never started over somewhere new. That was the lie they sold everyone." Helena's stomach turned. "Do you think she's dead?" Parker's expression darkened. "I think she ended up where he wanted her. And I think Valeria is there too." Helena took a step closer. "Where is that?" Parker hesitated. "I've been watching the cabin. You're not the only one who found it. And you're not the only one who's pissed off Caldwell." Helena's pulse quickened. "You were there last night. You saw me. Yeah, and I saw him too. Parker's gaze was intense. Caldwell doesn't go there often, but when he does, it's to make sure nothing is left behind. A chill ran through Helena. Then we need to move fast. Parker studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. There's another property, one that Caldwell doesn't list anywhere. I think it's where Lauren was taken. And if Valeria's still alive, that's where she is now. Where? Helena asked. Parker glanced over his shoulder, then back at her. I'll show you. But once we go looking, there's no turning back. Helena didn't hesitate. Then let's go. Chapter 7. The House That Didn't Exist. Helena followed Logan Parker's truck down a stretch of isolated back roads, her fingers tight on the wheel. The road was nothing more than packed dirt and gravel, winding through dense trees that cast shifting shadows in the moonlight. It was the kind of road that didn't show up on maps. The kind of road you only found if you knew exactly where you were going. Parker maintained a steady speed, his truck's taillights glowing dimly in the distance. His movements were deliberate, as though he had driven this road countless times before, knowing exactly where each bend and dip lay. Helena didn't need to ask him how he had found this place. She already knew. He had been tracking Caldwell long before she had. They drove for nearly 40 minutes before Parker finally slowed. He pulled off onto an overgrown path, barely visible between the trees. Helena eased her car in behind him, cutting the engine as he stepped out of his truck. "We walk from here," he said, voice low. Helena grabbed her flashlight but didn't turn it on. "How far?" "Half a mile, maybe less. It's tucked in the woods, completely out of sight from the road." Helena nodded, falling into step beside him. They moved quickly, but carefully, the sound of their boots muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and pine. The deeper they went, the quieter the world became. After several minutes, the trees began to thin, revealing a clearing just ahead. Parker lifted a hand, signaling her to stop. "There," he whispered. Helena followed his gaze. A house stood in the middle of the clearing, its shape blending into the darkened landscape. It was an old Victorian, its once white paint now peeling, the windows covered with thick blackout curtains. Unlike the cabin, this wasn't a place for temporary use. Someone had lived here. Someone still might. "It's abandoned?" she asked. Parker shook his head. "Not exactly. It's kept off the grid, no listed owner, no utility records. Caldwell never visits in the daytime, but I've seen cars come and go late at night. No one ever stays for long." He looked at her. "This is where he took Lauren, and I'd bet my life it's where Valeria is now." A flicker of movement caught Helena's eye. One of the curtains in an upstairs window shifted, then stilled. Someone was inside, watching. Waiting. Helena's heart pounded. "We need to get closer," Parker hesitated. "If Caldwell is here, this could go south fast. Then we move carefully. If Valeria is inside, we're running out of time." They approached from the side, keeping to the cover of the trees. As they drew closer, Helena noticed more details. The way the front door had 3 separate locks, the faint glow of a single light filtering through a downstairs window. This wasn't just a house. It was a holding cell. They crouched behind a thick cluster of bushes near the back of the house. Parker motioned toward a basement window, its glass dirty but unbroken. "You see that?" Helena followed his line of sight. A faint smear ran across the inside of the glass, something barely noticeable. She shifted slightly, angling her view. It was a handprint, Her stomach turned. Someone had been pressed against that window, reaching for the outside world. Parker exhaled sharply. "We're not leaving without answers." Helena nodded. "Then let's find a way in." She scanned the back entrance, noting the reinforced locks and security features. This wasn't a house meant to be broken into. It was meant to keep someone in. As Parker moved toward the side of the house, Helena studied the surrounding area. The ground was uneven, patches of disturbed dirt scattered near the back fence. Someone had been digging. She crouched, running her fingers over the earth. The dirt was loose, recently turned. A sinking feeling crept into her chest. Was this a burial site? Had Caldwell already covered his tracks? She was about to call Parker over when another movement from the house caught her attention. A shadow passed by the upstairs window. Too quick to be a trick of the light, her breath caught. Whoever was inside wasn't asleep. Helena turned to Parker, whispering, "We need to move, now!" He met her gaze, eyes dark with understanding. "Let's do this carefully." As they positioned themselves for their next move, the feeling of unseen eyes watching them sent a chill down Helena's spine. This wasn't just another missing persons case. This was a game of survival, and they had just stepped onto the board. Chapter 8. A Locked Door. Helena's breath was slow and controlled as she crouched behind the dense brush with Parker, both of them staring at the looming house in the clearing. The feeling of being watched hadn't faded. If anything, it had intensified. Someone inside knew they were here. The wind rustled through the trees, shifting the leaves overhead, but the house itself remained still, almost unnaturally so. The single light, flickering behind a curtained window, cast just enough of a glow to make out the faint outlines of the Victorian's aging features. It had once been a beautiful home, but time and neglect had stripped it of its charm. Now, it was just another place where people disappeared. Parker motioned for her to follow as he moved low to the ground, keeping to the shadows along the back fence. Helena followed, careful to step where he did. The dirt was soft here, disturbed in patches. Someone had been digging. Parker didn't stop, but she did, just long enough to crouch and brush her fingers across the loose earth. It hadn't been dug deep, but it had been recently disturbed. Her pulse quickened. "What is it?" Parker's whisper was sharp. She shook her head. "Not sure, but it's fresh." His jaw tightened. "We check it after. First we find a way inside." Helena nodded, forcing herself to move on. She'd spent years trusting her gut, and her gut told her that whatever was beneath the surface here wasn't going to be something they wanted to find. They reached the back of the house. Parker pressed himself against the wall, nodding toward the door. Helena could see it clearly now. 3 separate locks, each one newer than the last. Someone had reinforced this entrance over time. Not to keep people out, to keep someone in. Parker tested the handle gently. Locked. Helena expected as much. She moved toward one of the basement windows, its frame coated in dust and grime. Carefully, she wiped a section clean and peered inside. Darkness, stale air, silence. But then, a shift. A flicker of movement. She barely had time to react before a face appeared. A pale, wide-eyed woman pressed against the glass. Helena inhaled sharply, her instincts kicking in. She pulled back just as the woman's mouth moved, forming a single word. "Help, Parker," she whispered, urgency tightening her voice. "There's someone inside." He was beside her in an instant, following her gaze to the window. The woman, thin, disheveled, terrified. Looked at them, pleading with silent desperation. "Valeria?" Helena whispered, but the woman shook her head frantically. "Not Valeria. Someone else." Parker cursed under his breath. "We need to get in, now." Helena scanned the back of the house, looking for an easier entry point. The back door was reinforced, the basement sealed. The windows were locked from the inside, but one, on the second floor, was slightly cracked open. She turned to Parker. "Think you can boost me up?" He gave her a look that said he wasn't thrilled with the idea, but he nodded. "Fast and quiet. If Caldwell's got someone watching, we don't have much time." Helena climbed onto his hands, and with a careful lift, she reached the ledge of the second-story window. Her fingers gripped the wood as she steadied herself, pushing the window open just enough to slip through. The inside of the house smelled of dust and something else, something faintly metallic. Blood. She landed softly, her boots making almost no sound on the old wooden floor. The upstairs hallway stretched before her, lined with closed doors, the dim glow of a single nightlight casting eerie shadows along the walls. Helena pulled out the small knife she kept tucked at her waist and moved carefully, listening. Silence. But downstairs, a noise. A door unlocking, footsteps. She pressed herself against the wall, heart pounding. Someone was moving through the house. Then, from behind one of the closed doors, a muffled sob. The woman from the basement. Helena didn't hesitate. She moved quickly, pressing a hand against the first door. Locked. The next, also locked. The third. It gave way. Inside, the room was small, bare, except for a cot and a bucket in the corner. And there, huddled against the far wall, was the woman from the basement window. Terrified. Weak, but alive. Helena moved toward her. "It's okay. I'm here to help." The woman stared at her, breath shaking. "He's here." A chill ran through Helena. Behind her, a floorboard creaked. Chapter 9. The Man in the Dark. Helena's breath hitched as the floorboard creaked behind her. The woman on the cot squeezed her eyes shut, pressing herself tighter against the wall, as if willing herself to disappear. Helena turned slowly, her fingers tightening around the small knife at her waist. The hallway outside was dark, but a shadow stretched along the floor, a silhouette cast from the dim glow of a nightlight down the hall. Someone was standing just outside the door, watching, a heartbeat of silence. Then the doorknob twisted. Helena acted on instinct, lunging forward and slamming the door shut just as it was pushed open. A grunt of surprise sounded from the other side, followed by a sudden, forceful shove against the wood. Helena barely managed to brace her weight against it. "Parker!" she hissed, hoping he was close enough to hear her from outside. Another shove, this one harder. The door frame rattled. Whoever was on the other side was strong. "Stay behind me," she told the woman. A final, violent push sent Helena stumbling back. The door flew open, crashing against the wall. A man stepped inside, tall, broad, dressed in dark clothes. But what caught Helena's attention first was his face half hidden behind a ski mask, only his eyes visible. Cold, calculated, familiar. Not Mark Caldwell, but someone who worked for him. The man barely hesitated before lunging at her. Helena sidestepped, ducking just as his arm swung wide. He was fast, but not a trained fighter. Not like she was. She drove her elbow into his ribs, hard, and he let out a grunt, staggering back. Helena seized the moment, grabbing the chair from the corner and swinging it between them. It wasn't much, but it created enough space for her to think. She was outmatched physically. He had size, weight, and raw power. She had speed and strategy. The woman whimpered behind her, pressing herself further against the wall. No time to hesitate. Helena made the first move. She lunged low, aiming for his knees, throwing her full weight against him. He stumbled, crashing into the dresser. A lamp tipped over, shattering against the floor. Noise. Too much noise. Parker had to hear this. The man recovered quickly, his breath sharp as he pushed off the furniture. His hand went to his belt, and Helena's stomach clenched. A knife. She saw the blade glint in the faint light a second before he swung. She dodged, barely, feeling the air shift as the knife passed inches from her face. Then, from the hallway, a cuss gunshot. The man froze. Parker. Helena's heart pounded as the masked man tensed, his breathing sharp and uneven. He was caught. Drop the knife. Parker's voice was steel. The man didn't move. I won't ask again, Parker warned. Slowly, the man's grip loosened. The knife hit the floor with a dull thud. Helena stepped back, exhaling. Parker moved closer, gun raised. You work for Caldwell? The man stayed silent. Not a denial. Parker's jaw clenched. Where is Valeria? Nothing. Helena studied him. He wasn't afraid. That was the problem. Either he didn't think they'd shoot him, or there's someone else here, she realized. The man's eyes flickered, just for a second. A tell. She was right. Then a crash from downstairs. A second man. Parker acted fast. He surged forward, slamming the masked man into the wall. We need to go. Now. Helena didn't argue. She turned to the woman, grabbing her wrist. Can you walk? The woman nodded weakly. I think so. Then let's move. They rushed into the hallway. Heavy footsteps thundered up the stairs. Whoever was downstairs was coming fast. Parker shoved the masked man aside, buying them a few seconds. They tore down the hall, reaching the window Helena had climbed through earlier. Go, Parker ordered. Helena climbed through first, landing in the dirt below. She turned, reaching up for the woman. Parker helped lower her down before following himself, just as the second man reached the bedroom. They sprinted for the trees. Shouts rang out behind them, but they didn't stop. Helena's lungs burned as she ran, guiding the woman forward. Parker was right behind them, his gun still clutched in his grip. They reached the tree line, disappearing into the darkness, just as a second gunshot echoed through the night. Helena didn't stop. Not until they were far enough away. They had gotten out. But Valeria was still missing. And now, Caldwell would know someone was coming for her. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10. The Last Move. Helena gripped the steering wheel, eyes darting to the rear-view mirror as she sped down the desolate road. The woman they had rescued, Emily, sat in the passenger seat. A former housekeeper from Caldwell's estate who had seen too much. She had tried to leave, tried to escape the web of control he spun around those in his orbit, but he hadn't let her go. Instead, he had locked her away, ensuring her silence. Now she was free, but the fear in her eyes said she wasn't sure for how long. Wrapped in Parker's jacket, shivering but silent, Parker sat in the back, his gun still in hand, gaze locked on the road behind them. No one's following us, he muttered, but Helena didn't ease her speed. Not yet. They had gotten out of the house, but they weren't safe. Not when Caldwell now knew someone was after him. Not when Valeria was still missing. Emily finally spoke, voice hoarse. He's going to find me. Helena tightened her grip on the wheel. Not if we find him first. They didn't stop until they reached an old roadside motel an hour outside of town. It was the kind of place where no one asked questions, and that was exactly what they needed. Inside, Parker helped Emily to the bed, while Helena pulled out her phone. "We need to move fast. Caldwell's not going to let this go. And we still don't have Valeria," Parker added. "Emily, do you know if she was ever in that house with you?" Emily shook her head. "No, I never saw her. But I heard things. Footsteps, crying. Sometimes late at night someone else was locked up somewhere else in the house. I thought I was alone, but I wasn't." Helena exchanged a look with Parker. "Caldwell wouldn't have left her there after we got in. He'd move her somewhere else. Somewhere more secure." Parker exhaled sharply. "Then we need to figure out where, fast." Parker pulled out a worn notebook from his bag, flipping through pages of handwritten notes, property lists, and maps. "I've been following Caldwell for years," he said. "There's one place I never could confirm, but I always had a bad feeling about it. Money moves through it, but nothing official ever shows up." Helena took the notebook, scanning his notes. She didn't need more data. She needed to trust her instincts. She stared at the address Parker had circled multiple times. Something clicked, a gut feeling she couldn't ignore. "That's it," she murmured, turning the notebook toward him. That's where he took her. He studied it, skeptical. "You sure?" Helena didn't hesitate. "I'm sure." Parker stood, checking the clip in his gun. "Then let's go." The drive to the property was eerily quiet. Emily had stayed behind with a trusted contact, someone Parker assured her would keep her safe. But Helena knew she wouldn't be safe until Caldwell was caught. They reached the new location just past midnight. It wasn't a cabin or a house. It was an old hunting lodge, secluded deep in the forest. The building was large, old, with a single light glowing in an upper window. Helena and Parker moved in low, weapons drawn. The front door was locked, but this time Helena had a different approach. She pulled out a stolen key fob from one of Caldwell's men at the house and pressed it against the scanner by the side entrance. A small beep. The lock released. Parker arched a brow. "That's new. Always come prepared." They slipped inside, the musty air thick with dust and something heavier. The scent of fear. They moved through the lodge carefully, listening. Then a sound, a muffled sob. Helena followed the noise to a door at the end of the hallway. She pressed her ear against it. "Valeria?" she whispered. Silence. Then a faint, desperate reply. "Please." Parker didn't wait. He forced the door open, and there she was. Valeria. Bound, exhausted, eyes wide with terror. Helena rushed forward, untying the ropes around her wrists. "We've got you. You're safe now." Valeria shook her head violently. No, he's here." The words barely left her lips before gunfire erupted from the hallway. Helena shoved Valeria down just as Parker fired back. Caldwell's men. They had walked right into a trap. Bullets splintered the wooden walls. Helena reached for her gun, blind firing toward the hall. Parker pulled Valeria behind him, shielding her as he took aim. A voice echoed from the hall, cold, amused. "Caldwell. You've made a mistake, Ms. Monroe." Helena's grip tightened. "So have you." A shadow moved in the doorway. Helena didn't hesitate. She fired, straight at Mark Caldwell. A grunt, a stumble. She hit him. Parker moved fast, covering her as they pulled Valeria toward the back door. More footsteps. More men. They were outnumbered. "Go!" Parker barked. "I'll cover you." Helena grabbed Valeria's hand, dragging her toward the trees. A shot rang out behind them, Parker taking another one of Caldwell's men down. They had seconds, maybe less. The moment they hit the tree line, headlights flooded the area. Sirens. The police. Helena turned, heart hammering. She saw Caldwell injured, furious, trying to escape into the woods just as officers tackled him to the ground. She exhaled sharply. It was over. Hours later, Helena sat with Valeria in the hospital, watching as a nurse checked her vitals. She was safe now. Caldwell was in custody, his empire crumbling, his secrets exposed. Among those secrets was the fate of his first wife, Lauren. Her name had been buried, just like the others, but now it was surfacing. Reports hinted at a remote burial site near his estate, one that authorities were already searching. "You saved me," Valeria whispered. Helena met her gaze. "No, you saved yourself. You held on. That's what matters." Parker leaned against the doorframe, nodding toward the television. News stations were already broadcasting Caldwell's arrest. "You did good, Monroe." She exhaled, exhaustion weighing down on her. This time, but as she watched the screen, a thought lingered. Caldwell was just one man. And there were more like him out there. Helena wasn't done yet. End of chapter and end of book. Like and subscribe to support our channel and to listen to more crime stories and murder mysteries.